Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Raka Ray. I am the Dean of the Social Sciences here at Berkeley. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to the 12th Baxter Liberty Initiative lecture, public lecture. First, I'd like to thank those who have made this possible, starting with Ambassador Frank Baxter, the Baxter Liberty Initiative Faculty Director and Professor Sarah Anzia, and of course our featured speaker, Matthew Continetti. On behalf of the Travers Department of Political Science, I want to thank you for joining today's program and for standing for what it represents. Our commitment to respectful, thoughtful, and open exchanges on campus. For over a decade, this series has provided a forum for students, faculty, and the broader public to explore the ideals of freedom and liberty in our political, social, and economic lives. So thank you once again for joining us today. We look forward to an engaging program. To begin with, I'd like you to please join me in welcoming Faculty Director of the Baxter Liberty Initiative and Associate Professor of Public Policy and Political Science, Sarah Anzia. Professor Anzia's research focuses on American politics with a focus on state and local government, elections, interest groups, political parties, and public policy. Sarah.
Hi, welcome everybody. It's great to see all of you here. I'm really excited to have this event and grateful to everybody who's made it happen, especially Ambassador Frank Baxter and our speaker, Matthew Continetti. The Baxter Liberty Initiative has been an important part of what we do here at UC Berkeley for over a decade. Through this initiative, we have been able to have a truly impressive group of thought leaders to our campus for the benefit of our students and our community. Thank you, Mr. Continetti, for coming all the way to Berkeley and for sharing your remarks today. And I want to recognize the contributions of Ambassador Baxter in leading this important effort. Through the Baxter Liberty Initiative, UC Berkeley has been able to collaborate with a number of prominent organizations as a result of their leaders and scholars being featured Baxter Liberty Initiative speakers. Today's speaker, for example, is Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, which was our first partner in Baxter Liberty Initiative programming. Our very first speaker was Arthur C. Brooks in 2012, at the time president of AEI, who gave a talk titled The Moral Case for Economic Liberty. So thank you, Matthew, for continuing this legacy of that partnership. It's my honor to introduce Ambassador Frank Baxter, who will be coming up to welcome today's speaker. A graduate of UC Berkeley in economics, Ambassador Baxter is chairman emeritus of Jeffries & Company and served as United States ambassador to Uruguay from 2006 to January 2009. He has a long list of civic contributions, including serving as trustee for the UC Berkeley Foundation. We're grateful for all you have done to provide this forum, so welcome.
Thanks so much, Sarah. You've been a great addition to this initiative. And Dean Ray, you're amazing. Thank you so, so much. Hello, everybody, and hello, wherever the diaspora is. We started this, I guess it was 12 years ago, with the idea that maybe the campus could use more ideas about a tradition that's been around since the Enlightenment. It certainly informed our founders, or most of our founders, who discovered, or thought they discovered, ways that governments before us had failed. And so they thought of, it's a big subject, which I know our speaker will get into the subtleties of it, but kind of the core things are limited government, separation of powers, market system, individual responsibility, individual freedom, and then it goes all the way from there. But I think that's the basic part. We've had great speakers, as Sarah said. We had Arthur Brooks, who's now a professor of happiness at Harvard University, and I think conservatives are already happy, as far as I can tell. And we had a Nobel Prize member. We had Jonathan Haidt, who certainly is not a conservative, but he's a student of a psychology student of both religion and politics, and he kind of told us that we're all right. We're kind of genetically designed, whatever side that we're on. But today, we are very, very lucky to have a best-selling author, really a Renaissance man. Matthew Continetti has been a journalist. He's been a political worker. He's written a number of books. And now, as Sarah said, he's a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where, as a result of Arthur coming here, our campus has had a long-term relationship with, and we just want to make it a little more with Matthew here. I know everybody's going to love hearing from him. I love his book. People were complaining about the size of it, but I liked every page. So, Matthew, please.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. It's great to be here at Berkeley. This is my first visit to the campus. Just a beautiful campus, the lovely Bay Area. I couldn't help noticing on my walk up the hill, though, the reserved parking for Nobel laureates only. And so I thought that was an interesting recognition of elitism in Berkeley. And I'll kind of get into that, perhaps the dynamic between populism and elitism in the course of my talk. So I want to begin 20 years ago. On July 7th, 2003, 3 months into the Second Iraq War, I showed up at 1150 17th Street Northwest in Washington, D.C. I had just turned 22 years old, and it was my first day as an editorial assistant at a magazine called The Weekly Standard. At the time, 1150 17th Street was the frontal cortex of the American right. On the same floor as the Weekly Standard was the Philanthropy Roundtable, an organization of center-right charitable causes, as well as the Project for the New American Century, a small think tank that devoted itself to reports on the state of American defenses and open letters urging the regime change in Saddam Hussein's Iraq that was taking place at the time. The top floors of 1150 17th Street housed the American Enterprise Institute, where I work today. That morning, I was walking not just into a building, but into an intellectual and political movement. In 2004, when two editors of The Economist magazine wrote a book called The Right Nation, Conservative Power in America, I felt a thrill of recognition when the authors identified 1150 17th Street as the center of a right bank of intellectual activity in the nation's capital that included the nearby Ethics and Public Policy Center, the offices of the Public Interest magazine 1 block away, as well as the D.C. offices of the Hoover Institution, which were then headquartered up the street near DuPont Circle in Washington. Well, that right bank, the conservative version of the left bank of intellectual activity in Paris, is all gone now. The building at 1150 17th Street was demolished in 2016. In fact, a friend reminded me recently that a fire broke out within its empty shell on election night. A physical manifestation, I think, of the election's impact on the conservatism of the era. The Project for the New American Century, nor the Weekly Standard exist any longer. 2003 is a distant memory, and the intellectual community housed within 1150 17th Street dispersed. I've spent the last decade wondering why. How, I asked, had Mitt Romney lost the 2012 election, only to see Donald Trump win it 4 years later? Was the Trump coalition, I wondered, the echo of Richard Nixon's silent majority, the Reagan Democrats, Newt Gingrich's Republican Revolution, or was it something different, something new? What explained, I asked, the gulf between my colleagues in Washington and self-identified conservatives beyond the Beltway? And why had matters long thought settled on the right, the benefits of trade, the blessings of immigration, and the occasional necessities of war become suddenly contested? Why, come to think of it, was there a conservative movement to begin with? As I read old books, magazines, journals, and letters, I found that 20th century conservatism had been motivated by a sense of impending crisis, a feeling that the free societies of Western civilization were endangered. The surface cause of this crisis, the conservatives in the 20th century believed, was the growth of the state and the expansion of territory under communist dominion. But the loss of physical ground, they went on, was only a consequence of a spiritual impoverishment, a lack of confidence, an unwillingness to take stands, an unwillingness to risk, to roll back threats. What had caused this enfeeblement? No one knew, or rather no one could agree. Traditionalists said one thing, libertarians said another, and this difference brought me to my first conclusion about American conservatism. It is not one thing. It is many different things, many squabbling, disagreeable things. Try to define American conservatism. There is no single answer, but the adjective modifying the noun provides a clue. American conservatism is exactly that, American as opposed to, say, European. Conservatives defend. When the term conservative was born in the late 18th century during the French Revolution and its aftermath, European conservatives defended the established institutions of monarchy, of state church, of aristocratic privilege, national language, culture. What about Americans? We have no king, no official religion, no titled classes. The national language takes care of itself. Indeed, it's becoming the world language. And our national culture is as multifaceted and wild and eccentric and, yes, violent as our population. So what do Americans conserve? Here's my answer. American conservatives defend the founding idea of liberty and the familial, communal, religious, and political institutions that sustain it. American conservatism must refer to the American origin, the founding, if it is to have any anchor and enjoy any success. My answer is not the only option, however. American conservatism is a contested tradition. The traditionalists that I mentioned earlier, well, they argue that order, justice, and religious virtue are of equal value and indeed superior to political and economic freedom. The libertarians take the opposite stand. For them, freedom is the primary value in all spheres of life. Religion and communal life, what the economist Milton Friedman called the ethical problem, that's best left to the individual to decide. Cold warriors argued that the preeminent concern of the 20th century was the rise of communism, and that meant a permanent defense establishment and intervention overseas to defeat the Soviet Empire. Agrarians despised capitalism as destructive of local folkways, particularly in the American South. Political philosophers on the West Coast said that conservatism was worthless unless it was based on the idea in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal. So-called fusionist conservatives thought that freedom and virtue work in tandem and that true virtue is uncoerced. Traditionalist Catholics said that those fusionists were totally wrong, and the primary end of political life is virtue, and that Americanism, this idea of constitutionalism, the Declaration, all of that is a false ideology. The neoconservatives looked at all of these other groups I mentioned skeptically and were ready to maintain the New Deal and indeed many programs of LBJ's Great Society. Then the paleoconservatives blamed the neoconservatives for polluting the right with statism, immigration, free trade, and foreign intervention. I'm barely scratching the surface. None of the different camps within American conservatism were ever as powerful as the others believed. And the picture becomes more complicated still when you consider that the divisions on the right are not only based in ideas, they are, in fact, structural. The Republican Party, for example, is not naturally conservative. It's a political party. It's not naturally anything. It reflects the values, the principles, and priorities of its membership. It's true that its leaders have a record of supporting constitutionalism and economic freedom over the last century, as I describe in my book, and many conservatives have called it home. But in its efforts to win 50% plus one of the vote, the GOP has often strayed from the principles of post-war movement conservatism. That is why the foremost goal of the American conservative movement in the second half of the 20th century was to capture the Republican Party and convert it into a vehicle for conservative public policy like it had been before FDR and the New Deal. But that conservative movement I mentioned is not the same as the GOP. The conservative movement has always had a separate existence and a tempestuous relationship with the Republican Party. The movement is comprised of institutions and of activists. These are the single-issue people, the advocates of gun rights, anti-abortion activists, advocates of the right to work, of property rights, taxpayer rights, school choice, religious freedom, family values. D.C. is filled with their offices. They all exist to pressure the Republican Party to hold it to account on their issue, and they're often disappointed. Their hopes are often unfulfilled. Like activists of all stripes, they have trouble taking yes for an answer. This conservative movement is greater than the intellectuals. Now, the intellectuals' books, magazines, newsletters, television appearances, and tweets give them a certain prominence in our public discourse, while in fact they are the smallest part of this conservative world I'm describing to you. In fact, you could fit all of the conservative intellectuals in America into this room, and you would still have, I think, room for the audience. Politicians pay far less attention to the intellectuals than to the interest groups. Party prerogatives matter even more. It's often tempting to take the intellectuals at their word, to assume that what they are saying reflects the biases of the conservative movement, the activists, as well as the agenda of the GOP. Don't make that mistake. Finally, there is a broader category of thinker who may dissent from mainstream conservatism, as I've described it, who may in fact criticize the American founding that I'm saying is so totally integral to an understanding of American conservatism. And this category of thinker may be extremely hostile to American culture and society, but they nonetheless oppose the left, and they belong to what I call the right. Right? So you have the right, then you have the Republicans, then you have the conservative movement, and then the very tiniest part is the conservative intellectuals. Each element of this coalition needs to be understood on its own terms, and none of it works together easily. For over a century, the intellectuals, activists, and politicians have been arguing about the relationship between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, between the place of minority rights in a majoritarian democracy, the tensions between a populist desire for liberty and an elite commitment to institutions, and the choices between isolationist protection and international engagement. Get two conservatives together, and you will have at least 3 points of view. This fractiousness has contributed to the movement's dynamism and success. It contributes to the movement's adaptability, its continued relevance. But the diversity of opinion within conservatism is often ignored. Outside observers, often historians, tend to downplay the differences on the right. They pathologize all of conservatism as the expression of status anxiety, of bigotry, phobia. I think they're not only wrong, but that they blind themselves to the realities of American politics and to the, yes, weaknesses of their own political persuasion. Conservatives should not make the same mistake, but they do. They commit the fallacy of composition. They take the part for the whole. That wouldn't happen if they devoted more attention to the study of their own past. And it is ironic that American conservatives are sometimes uniquely uninterested in their own past. Conservatism is not monolithic, nor is history linear. As the sociologist Daniel Bell used to joke, the greatest historian in the world is Dr. Hindsight. When we look at the past, we need to recognize the influence of personal agency, of individual human will, and we need to recognize the role of chance. What appears to us as a logical chain of events was actually contingent. Conservatives like to say that ideas have consequences. I believe that's true. I also believe that accidents have consequences too. We don't like to admit it. Conservatives and liberals tell themselves stories about the American right. Conservatives say that their movement began in the wilderness. Then William F. Buckley, Jr., the founder of National Review, came along, and he led the American right to political relevance by helping to win the 1964 Republican nomination for Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater. Goldwater lost that year, and by a considerable margin, in 1964, but the ashes of his candidacy, according to this story, were fertile soil for Ronald Reagan, who brought conservatives to power in 1980. Since the heights of Reagan's presidency, conservatives say, the movement has endured setbacks and diversions. Conservatism still shapes American democracy, though, they continue, through the set of intellectual institutions and media platforms that gives it a voice in public debate and an influence in politics that was unimaginable at the beginning of their story, when the movement was in exile. And yes, these conservatives admit that Donald Trump's June 2015 descent on the escalator in Trump Tower caused friction within the movement and the party. But they also believe, now at least, that he recalibrated conservatism along populist and nationalist lines and attracted new constituencies to its cause. What's funny is that the liberal version of the story is not that different. It also begins slightly after World War II. It also begins with conservatives in exile. But the left tends to ascribe the rise of the right not to failures of liberal governance, but to a racist backlash against civil rights that has only grown worse with time. While the story that conservatives tell themselves highlights institutions and politicians, the left tends to play up grassroots organizations, big league financial donors, and psychological motivation. For the left historians, the story of American conservatism is simply the story of American populist reaction. It is a long-running berserk refusal, according to this narrative, to submit to the ministrations of do-gooders. For the left, Donald Trump is not a deviation from American conservatism. He is its endpoint. Now, I believe that both stories contain elements of truth, but neither captures the American right in its full complexity. The conservative narrative is too neat. The edges of the movement have been smoothed over. Its blemishes have been covered up or ignored. But I also believe that the left's narrative overcorrects for the right's mistakes. What happens is that this narrative ends up pathologizing conservatism, reducing a vast and complex movement and intellectual genealogy to nothing more than the expression of base prejudice. This diagnosis may explain the behavior of some of the men and women who have associated with the conservative movement and have voted for Republican candidates over the last century, but I do not believe it diagnoses the whole. No, I think that both the conservative and liberal stories are too pat. They give the impression that it was always inevitable that conservatism would arrive at this very moment. Well, it wasn't inevitable. Nothing is inevitable, at least nothing in the realm of human affairs. Part of the problem is that both the conservative and liberal stories are warped by what I call the Reagan distortion field. They revolve around the 40th president to such a degree that they can't see past him. They take him as the central character in the history, when in fact he should be treated as one character among many. Both conservatives and liberals treat Ronald Reagan as the benchmark of conservatism, the measure of what conservatism was and what it should be today. For conservatives, Reagan is the protagonist in a hero's journey that begins in the Screen Actors Guild and ends with him riding off into the California sunset. For liberals, Reagan is either a befuddled clown or a charming adversary. He either accidentally or slyly manipulated white America into enacting a pro-corporate agenda of tax cuts, reductions in welfare spending, and hostility to organized labor. Certainly, Ronald Reagan's historical importance cannot be denied, but neither can his uniqueness, his novelty. Reagan's charisma and clarity were an exception in the history of American conservatism, not the rule. His unique political talent led almost every faction within the right to think that he was on its side. To this day, every conservative wants to claim Ronald Reagan. Just recently, the Pew Foundation asked Republicans which president had done the best job in the past 40 years. Reagan still comes in first place, but Donald Trump is creeping up close behind. The truth is messier. Ronald Reagan's presidency was not the preordained outcome of the post-war conservative movement. Reagan always was just one alternative among many. His triumph in 1980 was unplanned. His victory in 1984 was a result of his staying the course with highly controversial and often unpopular policies. Conservatives griped about Reagan throughout his years in office, and he didn't acquire mythic status until years after he left the White House. When you focus on Ronald Reagan, you're tricked into thinking that ideas can be seamlessly translated into action and that conservative elites share the same priorities as the conservative grassroots. This is an error. Reagan shows us what is possible on the right, as he often said he wanted to do. But he is the exception. It's rare for elites in the public to agree. More often, they are in tension. Does American conservatism represent insiders or outsiders? Are conservatives the elites, the men and women in charge of America's political, economic, social, cultural institutions? Or are conservatives the people? That is the question that faces every generation on the right, and it is a question that has never been satisfactorily answered for long. The story of American conservatism, in my view, is a dynamic between elite-driven ideas and populist mobilization against extremes on the left. Conservatives have toggled between these two strategies, ideas and mobilization, as they have built institutions and professional networks and have tried, as best they can, to meet normal people where they are, to respond to those ambitions, those passions, and yes, those enmities. No tricks are involved. Any successful political movement must incorporate both elites and the people. But only intermittently have conservatives been able to synthesize these two elements. That is why conservatives' victories have been so tenuous, and why the conservative coalition is so fragile. Let me give you an example of an elite-driven strategy. The Austrian economist Friedrich Hayek published The Road to Serfdom in England in 1944, and it came out in America the following year. Dedicated to the socialists of all parties, Hayek warned that abandoning economic freedom for central economic planning would set nations on the primrose path to totalitarianism. Yet books, even books as popular as The Road to Serfdom, were not enough for Hayek. He wanted to build an institution devoted to the promotion of economic freedom and individualism. He wanted to establish a global network of classical liberals. Its first meeting was held in Montpellier in Switzerland, and the conference opened on April 1st, 1947. On April 10th that year, the attendees agreed to a statement of aims. The document left no doubt that these beleaguered classical liberals felt themselves engaged on the losing side of a battle of ideas that had been raging for more than a century at that point. Quote, over large stretches of the Earth's surface, the essential conditions of human dignity and freedom have already disappeared, the statement began. The position of the individual and the voluntary group are progressively undermined by extensions of arbitrary power. Now, at this point, the group still hadn't settled on a name. And the debate grew so intense among the attendees about what they should call it that one economist simply said, well, let's just name it by the place where we're staying. No one had a better solution, and so the Montpellieran Society was born. Hayek articulated this elite-driven strategy in a 1949 essay called The Intellectuals and Socialism. Hayek believed that ideas drive history, and thus intellectuals, what he called professional second-hand dealers in ideas, were far more important than most people assume. In every country that has moved towards socialism, Hayek wrote, the phase of the development in which socialism becomes a determining influence on politics has been preceded for many years by a period during which socialist ideas govern the thinking of the more active intellectuals. It's ironic, Hayek went on, that parties of the left so often interpret public affairs as the clash of economic interests, despite the overwhelming influence that ideas exercise over the climate of opinion that shapes politics. To revive classical liberalism, Hayek concluded, it was necessary to inspire the second-hand dealers of ideas, the intellectuals. Hayek's approach was directed at the people running things. A change in ideological perception and then in political reality would come about only after enough intellectuals became convinced of the classical liberal worldview. The libertarians associated with Hayek turned to education, writing great works and popular pamphlets, issuing new editions of classical liberal texts, teaching at universities and in privately funded seminars, all to pull the rising generation of elites toward their viewpoint. Elite-driven strategies begin with the work of intellectuals whose ideas shift the climate of opinion in society by permeating institutions and gradually shaping the minds of young people. Consider the life of Irving Kristol, the journalist and social philosopher who went from supporting Leon Trotsky in 1942 to endorsing Richard Nixon in 1972. And that's quite a journey. Long before he joined the American Enterprise Institute, where I work, Kristol became convinced that social science was being put to bad uses and that policymakers needed correction. He and his friend, the aforementioned Daniel Bell, launched a quarterly journal, The Public Interest, in 1965, where good, accessible social science would disprove its erroneous conventional wisdom of their fellow liberal intellectuals. The Public Interest never enjoyed a high circulation. Kristol used to joke that he never wanted the magazine to have more than 700 subscribers, so long as they were the right subscribers. He wasn't interested in money. Many years after the founding of the magazine, around the turn of the 21st century, when the internet was just taking off, a young editor at the Public Interest suggested to Irving Kristol that the magazine create a website. It took some convincing, but Kristol grudgingly agreed. "Do whatever you want," he said somewhat ironically, "but I can't stand the thought of all those vulgar people reading my magazine." The Public Interest aimed at nothing less than the assembly of an alternate faculty of social science. Its contributors applied the law of unintended consequences to the study of social programs. In issue after issue of the magazine, they evaluated government not on its intentions, but on its results. And they found the results, more often than not, unsatisfying. Over the course of its 40-year lifespan, the Public Interest disproved for its audience the shibboleth that government is always and everywhere the best way to reduce inequality and promote social health and happiness. This elite-driven strategy I've been talking about was based on conservative mastery of what one former vice president of the Heritage Foundation called the decision-making loop. Formulate concepts, communicate them to policymakers, and watch as theory is translated into practice. But here, conservatives faced a dilemma. Since 1932, they rarely found themselves in positions of power. Gaining access to the levers of policy required another force. It required populism. What is populism? Like with conservatism, there is no easy answer. The late Jeffrey Bell, a longtime Republican consultant, once defined populism as confidence in the decision-making power of everyday people, while elitism is confidence in the decision-making power of experts. Popular revolt takes place when long-standing policies no longer live up to their promise, when elites or experts won't acknowledge or respond to changing circumstances, and when those same elites interfere in private decision-making, especially decision-making involving the family. Populism is a feature of democracy, and the United States has a long experience with it. And populism is a catalyst for political change. It expresses neglected concerns. It frames politics as a debate between elites and the people, and whoever is on the side of the people tends to win. But populism has serious drawbacks. It can descend into the rule of the mob. Demagoguery is its handmaiden. Populists often look for scapegoats. They succumb to conspiracy theories. Without proper direction or moderation, populism can turn radical, rebellious, and law-breaking. Populism has no guiding principle other than the people. Yes. And without principle, things can turn ugly. Populism has left and right varieties, and they tend to bend toward each other at the extremes. But populism, the rejection of expert rule, has also fueled some of conservatism's greatest victories from the late 1960s to today. As Irving Kristol once put it, quote, "There is nothing like the utopian idiocies of the extreme left, the infantile left, as Lenin called it, to stir thoughts of moderation among the centrist majority. When experts screw things up, when they attempt to get involved with children, populism rears its head, and conservatives have tended to win." For much of the 20th and early 21st century, conservatism and populism worked in tandem. They were synchronized. They produced a conservative governing class in the presidencies of Reagan and the two Bushes. But beginning in George W. Bush's second term, elite-driven conservatism began to diverge from the populist grassroots. It wasn't only the liberal elites that the populists started challenging. they began to go after conservative elites, too. The divide, I believe, emerged with the debates over immigration in George W. Bush's second administration. It was visible in the anti-war Ron Paul Liberty movement in 2008. By the time of Barack Obama's presidency, the populists were in open revolt against the D.C. establishment, what they call today the Uniparty. The Tea Party was a vehicle to remove pro-war, pro-immigration, and pro-trade Republicans. And here the 2012 election, I think, was a critical turning point. In some ways, Mitt Romney represented the ideal of elite-driven conservatism. And he lost quickly and definitively. And President Obama's second term ushered in what I describe as a crisis in democratic legitimacy. The 2014 border crisis in particular, and Obama's subsequent expansion of his Deferred Action Program, despite his stated position dozens of times that he lacked power to do so, and a midterm election in 2014 that went horribly for him and his party, convinced this populist grassroots, which had already been moving away from conservative ideas, that only a disruptor could rebalance the system. Civil unrest at that time and chaos abroad with the rise of ISIS caused many people to think that the situation in the United States was spiraling out of control. Meanwhile, years of slow growth had dulled the American economy. The populists turned to Donald Trump as an outsider who could run government like a business, secure the southern border, and reorient the nation away from the policies of Barack Obama. International trade became Trump's way of explaining the collapse in male labor force participation and the growth of deaths of despair from drug and alcohol abuse. Trump's strongest supporters within conservatism came from the network of institutions, spokesmen, and causes that had propelled the populist revivals in the late 1970s. Trump was anti-Republican establishment. All the single-issue groups eventually coalesced behind him. He did well where former Alabama Governor George Wallace had done well in 1968. When Trump became president, he basically tore apart that decision-making loop, even as he ended up adopting many of the policies that elite conservatives had been advocating for decades. What began in the 20th century as an elite-driven defense of the classical liberal principles enshrined in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States has ended up in the first quarter of the 21st century as a furious rebellion against elites of all stripes. Many on the right have embraced a cult of personality and illiberal tropes. And the danger is that alienation from and antagonism toward American culture and society can turn into a generalized opposition toward the constitutional order itself. What are conservatives to do? What is conservatism for? As the future unfolds, I believe that conservatives must return to the wisdom of their best minds and advocates. As William F. Buckley Jr. said in 1970, quote, "I see it as the continuing challenge of American conservatism to argue the advantages to every one of the rediscovery of America, the amiability of its people, the flexibility of its institutions, of the great latitude that is still left to the individual, the delights of spontaneity, and above all," and this is Buckley here, "the need for superordinating the private vision over the public one." It's a Buckley word. This rediscovery of America must center on America's founding documents, for there would be no American conservatism without the American founding. The Constitution and its amendments ground conservatives eager to preserve and extend the blessings of liberty that are the right of every American. The Constitution grounds conservatives in a uniquely American tradition of political thought that balances individual rights and popular sovereignty through the separation of powers and through federalism. The Constitution not only protects human freedom, but it also creates a space for the deeper satisfactions of family, religion, community, and voluntary association. A free society, wrote Hayek, needs permanent means of restricting the powers of government, no matter what the particular objective of the moment may be. And the Constitution, which the new American nation was to give itself, was definitely meant not merely as a regulation of the derivation of power, that's Hayek's German coming through, but as a constitution of liberty, a constitution that would protect the individual against all arbitrary coercion. One cannot be an American patriot without reverence for the nation's enabling documents. One cannot be an American conservatism without regard for the American tradition of liberty those documents inaugurated. America cannot abandon the great principles of classical liberalism, wrote the philosopher Harvey Mansfield, above all the principle of self-government, and with it the constitutional means for achieving and preserving self-government. The long and winding road on which the various bands of conservatives have traveled over the last century has brought them to a fair amount of political power, but also, as we meet, to cultural despair. Conservatives are confused, they're uncertain, anxious, and they're inward-looking. That building at 1150 17th Street is gone, but the story does not end there. Can conservatives harmonize their principles with the sentiments of the American people? Can they reformulate a conservative governing class, reconstitute such a class for the second quarter of the 21st century? I am confident that they can, for when you study conservatism's past as I have, you become convinced that it has a future. Thank you all very much.
Okay, thank you so much. We have about 25 minutes for questions for Mr. Continetti, and there are note cards and pens, pencils being passed around. So if you write your question and bring it up here, I would be happy to read it out. And I will get things started off with apologies for doing this, but I'm going to start with a political science question because I loved your book. Thought it was just really entertaining, informative, and just learned so much from it. And what strikes me is precisely the point that you began with, which is the fragmentation, the tension, all of the different individuals and groups who are sort of jostling for and fighting with one another on the right. And this struck me as in contrast to a couple of things that in political science have been put forward as empirical truths. There is some debate about this. One is that the GOP, the Republican Party, has moved to the right, and in addition, and at the elite level, in addition, that compared to the Democratic Party, the Republican Party is much more cohesive. It is built around, and this is from Grossman and Hopkins, it's built around ideas, ideology, and there's just more of a there than there is on the left or in the Democratic Party, which is thought of as more a fragmented coalition of groups. And I wonder if that's just wrong, right? Is that wrong? And is there more that is similar, right, on the right and the left or in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party? And that maybe it's just that it's where we sit that shapes our view of those differences? Or is there some difference? Is there greater cohesion on the right than there is on the left?
Sure. Well, so history is a study of continuity and change. My colleague at the American Enterprise Institute, Michael Barone, published a very short book right at the beginning of the pandemic, so it didn't receive the attention it deserved, about America's two political parties. And he noted that the Republican Party, since its founding in 1854, has been the party of voters who consider themselves normal Americans, but who do not comprise an actual majority of the country. Whereas the Democratic Party traditionally has been a constellation of groups, all of which find themselves estranged from that normality, and yet together do constitute a majority. And in this very small book, I think Michael does a good job of talking about how that continuity has persisted over time. However, I do think there has been some change in the idea that the Republican Party is more ideas-driven or more cohesive than the Democratic Party, which for much of the 20th century has been really a coalition of interest groups. And I think that has to do with the changing composition of the Republican electorate. Nixon and Reagan's large majorities, the 1994 Republican Revolution, which ushered in Republican congressional control for the first time in 40 years, even George W. Bush's re-election in 2004, the last time the Republican Party received over 50% of the vote in a presidential election. All of them were driven by college-degreed suburbanites, working with the more rural basis and of what was once the Democratic Party, but now the Republican Party, and white voters without college degrees. Since 2012, white voters with college degrees have been leaving the Republican Party in droves. And that means that the party is changing its ideology, its attitudes, its tactics, and it's in fact it's not as cohesive ideologically as it was during, say, the Nixon-Reagan supermajorities or even the George W. Bush years. And you see this, I think, in several debates that are happening in the country right now. North Carolina, the state legislature, controlled by Republicans, recently approved a Medicaid expansion. And the traditional Republican belief in limited government would have pushed back any expansion of Medicaid in the state. But the Republicans approved it. Why? Because they are predominantly now a rural party, and the rural communities depend on Medicaid for health care. In several states, there's widespread action on what is called school choice, but essentially universal educational savings accounts, modeled off Arizona legislation. Iowa passed it. Arkansas passed it as well. They're having real trouble in Georgia and in Texas, too, applying a similar policy. And the reason is because in some of these rural localities, there's only one school, and the superintendent is basically the most important person in the area. And they don't want school choice. They don't want educational savings accounts because, really, what are the alternatives, right? So I think there you see the changing nature of the GOP affecting what was once a more ideologically cohesive party. And as we can see just by following the headlines, leading to real debates about, say, entitlements, about the size of government, and of course about foreign policy as well.
Okay, this is a question from the audience. What are the prospects of your constitution-based conservatism success when the mass public are largely ignorant, indifferent, or even hostile to these principles of liberty?
Sure. I mean, I'm always asked about this. I'd like to think that the public is no more ignorant or hostile to any of these ideas than it was in 1944 when Hayek published his Road to Serfdom, or when it was in the 1950s when National Review was created and was considered kind of a crackpot magazine. So there is a sense with conservatives that you believe in these principles. You recognize that they're not always going to be popular, but you have to abide by them anyway. I think what has surprised many people in my position is that we've long assumed the challenge would come from a populist left that wants to kind of break through any mediating institutions in order to realize its vision of society. What we didn't account for, and what is now coming into being, is a simultaneous challenge from a populist right that is becoming increasingly alienated from American democracy. And so that means now that it's a two-front battle. And you have to pursue it in both the ways I talked about in my remarks. Elites need to talk about ideas, formulate concepts, try to educate people, young people in particular, while hopefully political actors are going to be more responsive to what voters are actually thinking, what they desire. And right now I find that neither party has actually been able to shake hands with the American middle for long, right? You may have a temporary, and you see this in the recent elections where we're kind of swinging between different configurations of power. And I think that's because not only pressures within each individual coalition, but also just kind of a sense of unknowing about what it is the American people want, even though we can see what they want. It's right there in the data, in my view.
Okay, how does DeSantis fit into the conservative movement?
Yeah.
How does he challenge Trump and win his supporters? Can he build a coalition?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think many people started the year, especially after the midterm result, thinking that DeSantis would be able to kind of re-engineer this decision-making loop. He would be able to reconnect the populist grassroots with the more elite-driven ideas strategy. And in fact, he has done that for a certain part of the conservative movement. He has brought in intellectuals to Florida, and they're reshaping the Florida state educational system. However, what I've noticed is that since February 9th, I believe, which is when former President Trump began attacking DeSantis ruthlessly, DeSantis he's responded not really how I would anticipate. He responded by actually moving more to the right, trying to carve out more of Trump's base, when in fact he needs to recognize that his only way of winning is having enough of the Trump base, but also still winning the non-Trump vote, which, while not a majority of the Republican Party, is still a significant plurality of it. He seems to think that he doesn't need to do that right now, that his primary mission is somehow to carve into the Trump vote. And I don't see that as a very successful strategy. I'm not the governor of Florida, and I wasn't reelected by about 1 million votes. So maybe he's more right about it than I am. But I think that was the great hope of people who wanted to see some type of cohesion between the populist grassroots and the conservative intellectuals. DeSantis was the hope, certainly the hope to move beyond Trump. I think that hope may be dimming, but it could be rekindled.
I have two questions that go together, I
Sure.
think. So, do the Republicans represent the interests of the working class more than the Democrats? And then, why did the idea of Donald Trump running government like a business succeed, whereas for Ross Perot it failed? And what role did the media play?
Okay. Oh, okay. So the working class. So everyone argues about how we define working class in the United States. People tend to say, "Oh, it's working class or people who work with their hands." I used to go by that definition, but then I realized, I'm a writer. I work with my hands too. So then I thought maybe working class are people who work on their feet. But really, the way that typically we read class is through education, and we clearly see now voters without college degrees flocking to the Republican Party. White voters by significant numbers for several years, but now too Hispanic voters without college degrees, Asian American voters, African American males are coming in greater numbers to the Republican Party. So we have this class bifurcation through the lens of education, and it's worth asking why. I think there's a major intellectual faction on the right that thinks, well, it's all material interest, and so the Republican Party needs to recognize that it needs to meet the material interests of these new working class voters. But in truth, when you look at the data, what's driving this working class toward the Republicans is not economics, it is culture, and a kind of disaffiliation or even disgust with the cultural tropes of the Democratic Party, which is increasingly stacked in the level of higher education. And so that's why we have this weird phenomena where the multiracial working class party is in fact the party of culture war more than it is, say, organized labor or redistribution. Trump as a businessman, why did he succeed when Perot failed? Perot in 1992. I think the clearest difference is Perot ran as a third-party candidate. Trump did not. Instead, he effected his takeover of the Republican Party, and so that won him the Republican voting apparatus. And in fact, he's leveraged his importance to that apparatus ever since. It's instructive I talk about in my book, the talk radio host Rush Limbaugh, who was a fierce critic of Ross Perot in 1992, but who by 2016 starts off saying, look, Trump's not a conservative, he's a populist, but more and more, especially after Trump is elected, becomes his diehard supporter. So I think it's his association with the Republican Party was the difference. We should also, as I say, accidents matter just as much as ideas. Trump won on a fluke, and I think that that flukiness becomes more apparent as the 2016 election fades in the distance. And he didn't win in 2020. His support for Trump, I've seen one study in the Washington Post said it meant a 5-point loss for a Republican candidate. Another study out of Tufts University I saw yesterday is 7 points. So it's a poison chalice he offers the Republican Party. So one could easily argue that it didn't work in either the case of Ross Perot or Donald Trump.
Okay, I have a cluster of questions that have to deal that are all about overlap between left and right and borrowing from each other. So I think that's one way of summarizing it. One question is, or request is, please comment on the small but growing idea among some conservatives of emphasizing left economic policy, welfare, et cetera, in support of conservative social goals, such as stable families.
Sure. This is a growing movement on the intellectual right. It's very energetic. It's especially energetic on Twitter, and they have a lot of conferences. I don't understand it. I think that there's some. They're taking a kind of a frankly Marxist explanation of the relationship between economics and culture that has just been. It's not empirically accurate, and so. I think that even though they've attracted a growing number of senators who are interested in their policies, and I think of Senator J.D. Vance from Ohio, Senator Hawley from Missouri, Senator Rubio from Florida, I'm not sure this idea that left-wing economics can promote the traditional family will take hold of the Republican Party in general. And again, mainly because I'm not sure it's actually true. I don't know of any historical examples. They have a few nations that they tend to highlight, but even when you get into the data on, say, Hungary, it's not clear to me that Viktor Orban's policies have strengthened the Hungarian family. So I don't see it being the widespread position of the Republican Party anytime soon. And I think its hold over a lot of intellectuals has more to do with a weakness of the more constitutionalist conservative position than anything else. And what that means to me is that people of my viewpoint need to do a better job educating people who are interested in the right before they go in directions that are hostile to democracy.
Okay, I'm going to ask two questions together. So one is about how well do conservative and liberal elites understand public opinion, and do they see themselves as aligned with it or in opposition? And then this is one question, and I'm just going to identify the person writing the question is Steve Hayward. One, because he wrote his name on the card. One frequent contributor to the old public interest was Robert Reich. Whatever happened to that guy? That's the serious question is. I know. Yes, Ambassador, thank you. The example of Reich as in the public interest brings to light a period of left-right elite collaboration to some extent, say 1965 to 2009. Is there any sign or prospect of that, bringing that back?
I'll answer that. I think it's beginning to come back a little bit. To take the example of my own institution, the American Enterprise Institute, we recently hired the political demographer Rui Teixeira, who is a lifelong Democrat, man of the left, veteran of liberal institutions, worked at the Center for American Progress for many years, but found that the culture there was stultified, and so he left to join the American Enterprise Institute. And we're also are associated with the writer and thinker Thomas Chatterton Williams at The Atlantic. He too is a liberal. He's a man of the left, but he has deep critiques of some of the more radical ideas on race that are being propagated today. So he finds that the AEI is the place where he can come and be welcomed and can have intelligent conversation and debate, or at least civil conversation and debate. So you see it. You also see, I love this recent Ezra Klein column on everything bagel liberalism, because it's just fascinating to see Ezra kind of move slowly to the center and even to beyond the center, maybe in the right direction, so to speak. And so the idea that's taking place in a lot of public policy circles on the left is supply-side progressivism, that progressives need to actually try to free up these bottlenecks, right, that are preventing building, that preventing housing, preventing all of the changes to our energy infrastructure that would be necessary if we really are to have a zero emissions economy. That, I think, is a potential for collaboration. But it will be a long time coming, I think.
So someone wants to know about the future you see for the Republican Party. Mm-hmm. Will the elite conservatives spin off? What happens to the moderate Republicans that believe in a woman's right to choose, such as Olympia Snowe, Sandra Day O'Connor?
Lisa Murkowski, Susan Collins. Well, a couple things. I think we're still living in the Trump era. I had a bet with my friend David Brooks. He thought Trump was going to fade away. This is last year. I told him no. Right now I'm winning the bet. I could be wrong eventually, but we're still in the Trump era. So I see the party continuing to be very populist, very interested in the culture war to almost the exclusion of everything else. The abortion issue, what's interesting about Trump is, even while he is personally extreme, his views are actually, I think, closer to the middle of the electorate on a lot of questions. So he got into a very public fight after the midterms with the pro-life movement, saying that anti-abortion extremism had cost several House seats. Now, of course, he's saying this because he doesn't want to blame himself for the losses. But he was, I think, onto something when he said that, the public will only take so much. And if you are for a no exceptions ban on abortion, that is not a publicly sustainable position, a politically sustainable position. So weirdly, Trump, who's out of office and has been saying again and again that any abortion legislation needs to have exceptions for rape, incest, and the life of the mother, is actually closer to public opinion than, say, DeSantis, who is about to sign a 6-week abortion ban in Florida. So how that cuts, I don't know. There were, despite, I think, setbacks that you can clearly attribute to the abortion issue, there are also cases like DeSantis with the 15-week ban he had signed in last year, or even someone like Mike DeWine of Ohio, who's considered a moderate Republican, had the largest margin of victory, I think, of any governor last cycle, but who has signed a very restrictive abortion bill as well, and that didn't necessarily impinge on his vote. However, I think just, one thing's governor, even a Senate race, you have other things to talk about. If there's an election between two presidential candidates and the issue is one is going to impose a nationwide abortion ban and the other is going to, the position of Biden is to, codify the Roe decision or something like that, I have a sense the public would probably lean toward the latter view. Now, what that does to the actual politicians, I'm not sure. I mean, Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins are still Republicans. I mean, that's kind of amazing. And I think they'll continue to be for a long time.
Okay, I'm going to get to a question about media, but first there's a question from a student that I want to make sure I read. I think this is the comment written, I think we've seen a rise in the perceived value of the opinion of the average American, the marginalized American, the non-elite American by those on the right and left. It seems like those on the right believe the left is elite-driven, and many on the left believe the right is too. Do you agree that populism is on the rise within both political camps, and is it incompatible with identity politics?
That's a big question. Populism on the rise in both camps. I think you could argue that in 2016 with the Bernie Sanders phenomenon, which accompanied the Trump phenomenon. It's interesting to note that Trump and Sanders received both the same total of their respective party primary votes, about 45%. But because the Republican rules, that 45% won Donald Trump the nomination, and because of the Democratic rules, Bernie was denied. I think since then, the Sanders movement has lost ground in the Democratic Party, despite the gradual doubling of the size of the squad that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is a part of. And my evidence for this is Ro Khanna, a local guy, who was co-chair of Bernie's 2020 campaign and really emphasized the issue of Medicare for all in that campaign. But my recent conversation with him he dropped Medicare for all completely. Not a priority. I mean, he still believes in it, but it's no longer a priority. Now he wants actually what he calls the new economic patriotism, which is a huge amount of industrial policy and spending, kind of the CHIPS Act plus quite a bit of money. So I think that is a reflection that perhaps left populism has been somewhat weakened in the United States, while right populism is still going incredibly strong. And by the way, that might be to the Democrats' institutional advantage. It's just a case that the Democrats seem to do a much better job of putting forward candidates who are closer to the mainstream opinion in suburban communities throughout the country than the Republicans do. And maybe it's because they're not as influenced by the populist currents on their own side.
Thank you. So 2 questions about the media. One is asking you to comment. I believe the person writes that I believe the long-term power of media has not been appreciated. Certainly, it has been notable in delegitimizing the Second Amendment. Comment, if you are able.
Yeah, media is very important. Media is a longtime enemy of the conservative movement that I described. In the founding documents in National Review, there's swipes at the liberal media of the time. Of course, the conservatives were up in arms over Walter Cronkite's treatment, among others, of Barry Goldwater in 1964. It's a long-running critique on the right of mainstream media. At the same time, in some ways, a more establishment, more consolidated media in the middle of the 20th century did not prevent Richard Nixon's 2 elections, did not prevent Ronald Reagan's 2 elections, did not prevent George H.W. Bush's election in 1988. And in fact, the more open, more expansive, more competitive media that we have today has coincided with a period where, as I mentioned, Republicans have not won the popular vote in 20 years. And they have lost 6 out of 7 past presidential elections. So I almost sometimes I long for the days of the 4 channels of the New York Times, because it seemed to do much better for the Republican Party than the era of Fox News Channel and Rush Limbaugh. It's now correlation's not causation, but I do think one has to reckon with that. So media bias is there, obviously, but it has not been an insurmountable obstacle in the past, and it may in fact be the case that conservative Republicans have become cocooned within their own media ecosystem to a degree where it blinds them to what most voters, or the swing voters, the independent voters who decide elections, actually care about.
I think this is actually probably a good question to end on. Okay. So, can you discuss how media and entertainment play in political education? Yeah. Is it making, or are they making, conservatism dead with younger individuals? Are youth more liberal, and what can conservatives do about that?
Well, I think any survey of the under 30 population shows this is a liberal population. It's been that way, actually, for about 20 years. It's not always the case. Reagan won the youth vote in his elections. But since 2004, really beginning with the reaction against the Iraq War, young people have aligned themselves with the left. Part of that is just, I think, the culture and just the growing up in a world where most people are simply exposed to conservatism through, late night talk show hosts' jokes about conservatism, right? And what they see of conservatism is its most populist, most anti-intellectual faces. So there's a long-running challenge there in order to meet young people where they are, to show that there's something in conservatism that can apply to them. I think particularly on the issue of the environment, conservatives need to do more work. But it's also the case, though, that Gen X, which in the 1990s was not really considered a right-wing bastion, is now like the most conservative age demographic in the country. And many of the voters who were 18 through 22 in 2008, right, are now reaching the 30-plus demographic in the 22 midterms and voting right. It's the same voters. So beliefs do change. And affiliation does change simply because the issues change and the personalities change. I do think that one reason young people today are hostile to conservatism or to the Republican Party is because so many people, not just young people, have a visceral reaction against Donald Trump. And to the degree that he is the face of the Republican Party, has been for 7 years, and I think will be for the foreseeable future, I do think that's a high hurdle for conservatives to overcome.
Thank you so much. This has been terrific, and we're at
Thank
the point
all.
where, thank you. So this is the moment when I get to invite you to join us on the terrace for refreshments. But before sending you off, I want to thank you, Mr. Continetti, for joining us for the excellent book you wrote, for one of the excellent books you've written, but the one that was most recently published, and for just helping us understand the history of the right and sharing your remarks with us today. And thank Ambassador Baxter for encouraging and facilitating and supporting the Baxter Liberty Initiative at UC Berkeley. I think at a time like now, when it can sometimes feel as though in parts of the country there's decreasing willingness to listen to and consider different perspectives, it becomes increasingly important to purposefully create spaces for the development and sharing of different ideas. And it's through that debate and holding a diverse array of events and facilitating conversations that our ideas get better, and that we better equip ourselves to confront and address the significant challenges we face as a country and as a planet. And that's the spirit of the Baxter Liberty Initiative, one of exchange, one of debate, one of ideas, and it's a really important part of what we do at UC Berkeley, and we have our speaker today and Ambassador Baxter to thank for that. So thank you, and please join us for refreshments.